Swann's Way, Combray 2, Part 13, by Marcel Proust. How often after that day, in the course of my walks along the Guermantes Way, and with what an intensified melancholy did I reflect on my lack of qualification for a literary career, and that I must abandon all hope of ever becoming a famous author. The regret that I felt for this while I lingered alone to dream for a little by myself made me suffer so acutely that in order not to feel it, my mind of its own accord, by a sort of inhibition in the instant of pain, ceased entirely to think of verse-making, of fiction, of the poetic future on which my want of talent precluded me from counting. Then, quite apart from all those literary preoccupations, and without definite attachment to anything, suddenly a roof, a gleam of sunlight reflected from a stone, the smell of a road would make me stop still, to enjoy the special pleasure that each of them gave me, and also because they appeared to be concealing, beneath what my eyes could see, something that they invited me to approach and seize from them, but that despite all my efforts, I never managed to discover. As I felt that the mysterious object was to be found in them, I would stand there in front of them, motionless, gazing, breathing, endeavoring to penetrate with my mind beyond the things seen or smelled. And if I had then to hasten after my grandfather, to proceed on my way, I would still seek to recover my sense of them by closing my eyes. I would concentrate on recalling exactly the line of the roof, the color of the stone, which, without my being able to understand why, had seemed to me to be teeming, ready to open, to yield up to me the secret treasure of which they were themselves no more than the outer coverings. It was certainly not any impression of this kind that could restore the hope I had lost of one day becoming an author and poet, for each of them was associated with some material object devoid of any intellectual value, and suggesting no abstract truth. But at least they gave me an unreasoning pleasure, the illusion of a sort of fecundity of mind, and in that way distracted me from the tedium, from the sense of my own impotence that I had felt whenever I had sought a philosophic theme for some great literary work. So urgent was the task imposed on my conscience by these impressions of form or perfume or color, to strive for a perception of what lay beneath them, that I was never long in seeking an excuse that would allow me to avoid this effort, and to spare myself the fatigue that it involved. As good luck would have it, my parents called me. I felt that I had not, for the moment, the calm environment necessary for a successful pursuit of my researches, and that I would be better to think no more of the matter until I reached home, and not to exhaust myself in the meantime to no purpose. And so I concerned myself no longer with the mystery that lay hidden in a form or a perfume, quite at ease in my mind, since I was taking it home with me, protected by its cloak of images, beneath which I would find it all still alive, like the fish which on days when I had been allowed to go out fishing, I used to carry back in my basket, covered by a layer of grass that kept them cool and fresh. Once in the house again, I would begin to think of something else, and so my mind would become littered, as my room was, with the flowers that I had gathered on my walks, or the odds and ends that people had given me, with a stone from the surface of which the sunlight was reflected, a roof, the sound of a bell, the smell of fallen leaves, a mass of different images under which must have perished long ago the reality of which I had some intuition, but which I never had the will to discover and bring to light. Once, however, when we had prolonged our walk far beyond its ordinary limits, and so had been very glad to encounter halfway home, as afternoon darkened into evening, Dr. Percipied, who drove past us at full speed in his carriage, saw and recognized us, stopped, and made us jump in beside him, I had an impression of this sort, and did not abandon it without subjecting it first to a somewhat more thorough examination. I had been seated beside the coachman. We were going like the wind, because the doctor had still, before returning to Combray, to call at Martinville-Sec, at the house of a patient, at whose door he asked us to wait for him. At a bend in the road, I experienced suddenly that special pleasure, which resembled no other, when I caught sight of the two steeples of Martinville, on which the setting sun was playing, while the movement of the carriage and the windings of the road seemed to make them continually change their position, and then of the steeple of Vosvik, which, although separated from them by a hill and a valley, and situated on a higher plateau in the city, appeared none the less to be standing right by their side. In ascertaining and noting the shape of their spires, the shifting of their forms, the sunny warmth of their surfaces, I felt that I was not penetrating to the full depth of my impression, that something more lay behind this mobility, this luminosity, something that they seemed at once to contain and to conceal. The steeples appeared so distant, and we ourselves seemed to come so little nearer to them, that I was astonished when, a few minutes later, we stopped in front of the church of Martinville. I still did not know the reason for the pleasure that I had found in seeing them on the horizon, and the obligation of trying to find out what that reason was seemed to me very tedious. I wished only to keep in reserve in my brain those lines moving in the sunshine, and for the time being to think of them no more. And it is probable that, had I done so, those two steeples would have joined so many other trees and roofs and scents and sounds that I had noticed and set apart on account of the obscure sense of pleasure that they gave me, but that I had never explored more fully. I got down to talk to my parents while we were waiting for the doctor to reappear. Then it was time to continue on. I climbed up again to my place on the seat, turning my head to look back once more at the steeples, of which, a little later, I caught a final glimpse at a turn in the road. Since the coachman, who did not seem inclined to chat, had barely acknowledged my remarks, I was obliged, for lack of other company, to fall back on my own and to attempt to recapture the vision of my steeples. And presently their outlines and their sunlit surfaces, as though they had been a sort of bark, split apart. A little of what they had concealed from me became apparent. An idea came into my head that had not existed for me a moment earlier, framed itself in words in my head, and the pleasure with which the first sight of them just now had filled me was so much more enhanced that, overpowered by a sort of intoxication, I could no longer think of anything but them. At this point, although we had now traveled a long way from Martinville, I turned my head and caught sight of them again, quite black this time, for the sun had meanwhile set. Every few minutes a turn in the road would sweep them out of sight. Then they showed themselves for the last time, and so I saw them no more. Without admitting to myself what lay behind the steeples of Martinville must be something analogous to a charming phrase, since it was in the form of words that gave me pleasure that it had appeared to me. I asked the doctor for a pencil and some paper, and composed, in spite of the jolting of the carriage, to ease my conscience and to satisfy my enthusiasm, the following little fragment, which I recently found again, and to which I had to make only a few revisions here and there. Alone, rising from the level of the plain, and seemingly lost in that expanse of open country, climbed to the sky the two steeples of Martinville. Presently we saw three, springing into position, confronting them by a daring vault. A third, a dilatory steeple, that of Vosvik, had come to join them. The minutes passed. We were moving rapidly, and yet the three steeples were always a long way ahead of us, like three birds perched on the plain, motionless and conspicuous in the sunlight. Then the steeple of Vosvik moved away, receded into the distance, and the steeples of Martinville remained alone, illuminated by the setting sun, which, even at that distance, I could see playing and smiling on their sloped sides. We had been so long in approaching them that I was thinking of the time that must still elapse before we could reach them when, all of a sudden, the carriage, having turned a corner, set us down at their feet. And they had flung themselves so abruptly in our path that we had barely time to stop before being dashed against the porch of the church. We resumed our course. We had already left Martinville a little while before, and the village, after accompanying us for a few seconds, had already disappeared when, lingering alone on the horizon to watch our flight, its steeples and that of Vosvik waved once again, in token of farewell, their sun-bathed pinnacles. Sometimes one would withdraw, so that the other two might watch us for a moment still. Then the road changed direction. They veered in the light like 3 golden pivots and vanished from my gaze. But a little later, when we were already close to Combray, the sun having now set, I caught sight of them for the last time, far away, and seeming no more now than 3 flowers painted on the sky, above the low line of fields. They made me think, too, of 3 maidens in a legend, abandoned in a solitary place over which night had begun to fall, and while we drew away from them at a gallop, I could see them timidly seeking their way, and after some awkward stumbling movements of their noble silhouettes, drawing close to one another, slipping one behind another, showing nothing more, now against the still rosy sky, than a single dusky form, charming and resigned, and so vanishing in the night. I never thought again of this page, but at the moment when, on my corner of the box seat where the doctor's coachman was in the habit of placing in a hamper the fowls he had bought at Martinville market, I'd finished writing it. I found such a sense of happiness, felt that it had so entirely relieved my mind of the obsession with the steeples and of the mystery that they concealed, that, as though I myself were a hen and had just laid an egg, I began to sing at the top of my voice. All day long during these walks, I had been able to muse on the pleasure that there would be in the friendship of the Duchesse de Guermantes, in fishing for trout, in drifting by myself in a boat on the Vivonne, and greedy for happiness, I asked nothing more from life. In such moments, then, it would always consist of a series of joyous afternoons. But when on our way home I had caught sight of a farm on the left of the road, at some distance from 2 other farms that were themselves close together, and from which to return to Combray we need only turn down an avenue of oaks, bordered on one side by a series of orchard closes, each one planted at regular intervals with apple trees which cast on the ground, when they were lighted by the setting sun, the Japanese stencil of their shadows. Then sharply my heart would begin to beat. I would know that in less than half an hour we would be home, and that there, as was the rule on days when we had taken the Guermantes' way, and dinner was served later than usual, I would be sent to bed as soon as I had swallowed my soup, so that my mother, kept at table just as though there had been company to dinner, would not come upstairs to say good night to me in bed. The zone of melancholy that I entered then was totally distinct from that other zone, in which I had been bounding for joy a moment earlier, just as sometimes in the sky a band of pink is separated, as though by a line, from a band of green or black. You may see a bird flying across the pink band. It draws near the end. It nearly touches the black. Then it has entered it. The longings by which I had just now been absorbed to go to the Guermantes, to travel, to live a life of happiness, I was now so remote from them that their fulfillment would have afforded me no pleasure. How readily would I have sacrificed them all just to be able to cry all night long in Mamma's arms. Trembling with emotion, I could not take my agonized eyes from my mother's face, which was not to appear that evening in the bedroom, where I could already see myself. In imagination, I wanted to die. And this state would persist until the next day, when the rays of morning, leaning their bars of light as the gardener might lean his ladder against the wall, overgrown with nasturtiums, which clambered up it as far as my windowsill, I would leap out of bed to run down at once into the garden, and with no thought of the fact that evening must return, and with it the hour which I must leave my mother. And so it was from the Guermantes way that I learned to distinguish between these states that reigned alternately in my mind, during certain periods, going so far as to divide every day between them, each one returning to dispossess the other with the regularity of a fever, contiguous and yet so foreign to one another, so devoid of means of communication, that I could no longer understand or even picture to myself in one state what I had desired or dreaded or even done in the other. So the Méséglise way and the Guermantes way remained for me linked with many of the little incidents of that one of all the various lives that we lead at the same time, the one that is the most abundant in sudden reversals of fortunes, the richest in episodes. I mean the life of the mind. Doubtless it makes in us an imperceptible progress, and the truths have changed for us its meaning and its aspect, that have opened new paths before our feet. We had for long been preparing for their discovery. But that preparation was unconscious, and for us, those truths date only from the day, from the minute when they became apparent. The flowers that played then among the grass, the water that rippled past in the sunshine, the whole landscape that surrounded their apparition lingers around the memory of them still with its unconscious or unheeding air, and certainly when they were slowly contemplated by this humble passer-by, by this dreaming child, as the face of a king is scrutinized by a petitioner lost in the crowd, that scrap of nature, that corner of a garden, could never suppose that it would be thanks to him that they were elected to survive in all their most ephemeral details. And yet, the scent of hawthorn that strays along the hedge, from which in a little while the wild roses will have banished it, a sound of footsteps followed by no echo, on a gravel path, a bubble formed at the side of a water plant by the river current, and formed only to burst. My exaltation of mind has borne them with it, and has succeeded in making them traverse all those successive years, while all around them the paths have vanished, and those who trod them, and even the memory of those who trod them, are dead. Since the fragment of landscape thus transported into the present will detach itself in such isolation from all associations that it floats uncertain in my mind like a flowering isle of Delos, without my being able to say from what place, from what time, perhaps quite simply from which of my dreams it comes. But it is especially as the deepest layers of my mental soil, as firm ground on which I still may build, that I must regard the Méséglise and the Guermantes ways. It is because I used to believe in things, in people, that while I was roaming along those ways, the things, the people that they taught me to know, and these things alone, I still take seriously, still give me joy. Whether it be that the faith that creates has dried up in me, or that reality will take shape in the memory alone, the flowers that people show me nowadays for the first time never seem to me to be true flowers. The Méséglise way, with its lilacs, its hawthorns, its cornflowers, its poppies, its apple trees, the Guermantes way, with its river full of tadpoles, its water lilies, and its buttercups, have constituted for me all the time the picture of the land in which I would like to live, in which my only requirements are that I may go out fishing, drift idly in a boat, see the ruins of a Gothic fortress, and find hidden among the wheat fields a Saint-André-du-Champ lay hidden, an old church, monumental, rustic, and golden as a haystack, and the cornflowers, the hawthorns, the apple trees that I may happen when I travel to encounter in the fields, because they are situated at the same depth, on the level of my past life, at once establish contact with my heart. And yet, because there is an element of individuality in places where I am seized with the desire to see the Guermantes way again, it would not be satisfied were I led to the banks of a river in which were water lilies as beautiful, or even more beautiful than those in the Vivant, any more than on my return home in the evening, at the hour when there awakened in me that anguish which later on in life transfers itself to the passion of love, and may even become its inseparable companion. I would have wished for any mother to come in and say good night to me, though she were far more beautiful and more intelligent than my own. No, just as the one thing necessary to send me to sleep contented in that untroubled peace that no mistress in later years has ever been able to give me, since one has doubts of them at the moment when one believes in them, and never can possess their hearts as I used to receive in her kiss, the heart of my mother, complete, without scruple or reservation, unburdened by any liability save to myself, was that it would be my mother who came, that she would incline toward me that face on which there was, beneath her eyes, something that was, it appears, a blemish, and which I loved as much as all the rest. So what I want to see again is the Guermantes way as I knew it, with the farm that stood a little apart from the two neighboring farms, pressed so close together at the entrance to the oak avenue, those meadows on which, when the sun renders them as reflective as a pond, are outlined the leaves of the apple trees, that whole landscape, whose individuality sometimes at night in my dreams binds me with a power that is almost fantastic, of which I can discover no trace when I awake. No doubt, by virtue of having permanently and indissolubly combined in me different impressions, for no reason except that they had made me feel them at the same time, the Méséglise and the Guermantes way, left me exposed, in later life, to much disillusionment and even to many mistakes. For often I have wished to see a person again without realizing that it was simply because that person recalled to me a hedge of hawthorns in blossom. And I have been led to believe and to make someone else believe in a revival of affection by what was no more than a desire to travel, but by the same qualities and by their persistence in those of my impressions today to which they can find an attachment. The two ways give to those impressions a foundation, depth, a dimension lacking from the rest. They also add to them a charm, a significance that is for me alone. When on a summer evening the resounding sky growls like a wild beast, and everyone is complaining about the storm, it is along the Méséglise way that my fancy strays alone in ecstasy, through the noise of falling rain, the odor of invisible and persistent lilacs. And so I would often lie until morning, dreaming of the old days at Combray, of my melancholy and sleepless evenings, of other days besides, the memory of which had been more lately restored to me by the savor, by what would have been called at Combray the perfume of a cup of tea, and by an association of memories of a story which many years after I had left the little town had been told me of a love affair that Swann had had before I was born, and with that precision of detail which it is easier sometimes to obtain about the lives of people who have been dead for centuries than about the lives of our most intimate friends, an accuracy that it seems as impossible to attain as it seemed impossible to speak from one town to another, before we learned of the contrivance by which that impossibility has been overcome. All these memories, added one to another, now formed a single mass, but had not so far coalesced that I could not distinguish them. I could not distinguish between them, between my oldest memories and those more recent, brought forth by a perfume, and then those that were merely the memories of another person from whom I had acquired them. If not fissures, geological faults, at least those veins, those streaks of color that in certain rocks and certain marbles reveal differences of origin, age, and formation. It is true, when morning drew near, I would long have settled the brief uncertainty of my waking dream. I would know in what room I was actually lying, would have reconstructed it around me in the darkness, and fixing my orientation by memory alone, or with the assistance of a feeble glimmer of light, at the foot of which I placed the window curtains, would have reconstructed it completely with its furniture, as an architect and an upholsterer might do, retaining the original plan of the doors and windows, would have put back the mirrors and set the chest of drawers in its accustomed place. But scarcely had daylight itself, and no longer the gleam from a last dying ember on a brass curtain rod, which I had mistaken for daylight, traced across the darkness, as with a stroke of chalk across a blackboard, its first white correcting ray, when the window with its curtains would leave the frame of the doorway in which I had erroneously placed it, while to make room for it the writing table that my memory had clumsily put where the window ought to be would hurry off at full speed, thrusting before it the mantelpiece, and sweeping aside the wall of the corridor. A little courtyard would be enthroned on the spot where, a moment earlier, my dressing room had lain, and the dwelling place that I had built up for myself in the darkness would have gone to join all those other dwellings that I had glimpsed in the whirlpool of awakening, put to flight by that pale sign traced above my window curtains, by the uplifted finger of dawn.